Hi everyone, I am Brooke O'Connell, a registered dietitian nutritionist at Optimum Nutrition. As a registered dietitian, I'm trained to advise and counsel people on food and nutrition. When we talk about overall fitness and wellness, it's so important to remember that what you consume throughout your day is just as important as the exercise and physical activity that you are doing. So we all know that we're supposed to eat healthy, but what does that mean really? And how can we overcome some common obstacles in order to maintain good nutrition habits? So in this video today, I'm going to share some fundamentals of good nutrition, as well as some tips for keeping you on track with your nutrition goals. So to start, I thought we could address some common topics that get brought up when we are talking about nutrition and how to follow a balanced diet. And the first one is kind of a hot topic. I know I hear all the time people saying that whole foods are best, but what is a whole food? And you may be surprised to learn that there actually isn't a regulatory definition for a whole food. But I do think it's kind of fair to say that we could define this as anything that is not processed or refined or even have any added ingredients to it. So when I think of whole foods, some of the main ones that come to mind are going to be fruits and vegetables, dairy products, whole grains, and then meat and fish. Another way that you could think of a whole food might be something that you're going to be consuming that's close to its original form with minimal processing that's been involved. And so speaking of minimally processed or just processed foods in general, I thought it would be helpful to maybe give you a couple examples of what a whole food is versus a processed food. So when we think about whole foods, again, maybe a good example of this is going to be a whole piece of fruit, such as an apple or a banana, or even some fresh vegetables. With processed foods, we're going to cover a little bit more of a wide range of foods just because there are also different types of processing that our foods are going to go under. It can be anywhere from minimally processed to heavily processed foods. An example of some minimally processed foods might be bagged vegetables. So, you're in the produce department and you might see maybe the bagged salad mixes. Those are going to go under some form of processing, but for the most part, they're pretty close to how they were going to be originally consumed. When we think of heavily processed foods, oftentimes what comes to mind for me at least is going to be things that have maybe some added sugar or some extra sodium in there. And for the general population, we want to be a little bit more mindful about those two ingredients especially, and then choosing foods that are maybe lower in added sugar and sodium. And so an example of maybe a more heavily processed food might be frozen meals or a frozen pizza. Sometimes I'll think of potato chips too, just because the amount of processing that has taken place is going to be more. And so another thing that comes up pretty often when we're thinking about foods is the term nutrient dense. And so I wanted to give you the definition of what a nutrient dense food is. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans definition of nutrient dense foods are those that provide vitamins, minerals, and other substances that contribute to adequate nutrient intakes or may have a positive health effect, with little or no solid fats and added sugars, refined starches, and sodium. All right, so I know that is a very long definition. So I have an example for you of a nutrient-dense food, and this is just one. There are many nutrient-dense foods out there, but I think of an orange when I think of nutrient-dense, just because we know that there's vitamin C in oranges. It also contains some natural sugars, and there's fiber in there. And so to me, that would be a good definition of a nutrient-dense food. Another thing that I also think about is I oftentimes kind of define whole foods and nutrient-dense foods very similarly. I think of them almost simultaneously. All right, so speaking of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, I thought it might be important to mention some key points from the recently published 2020 to 2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. And the theme is actually to try to make every bite count. And so scientific experts recommend starting with these 4 guidelines because it is, sometimes it's kind of hard to know where to start, or even if you are trying to make good dietary choices, how can I improve or what can I do differently? so scientific experts recommend, following a healthy dietary pattern. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Customizing and enjoying nutrient-dense foods and beverages to reflect your personal preferences, your cultural traditions, and your budgetary considerations. Those are all important things that we do need to think about when we think about food. Also, the next one would be focus on meeting food group needs with nutrient-dense foods and beverages while staying within your calorie limits, because that's another one that we oftentimes might fall short in. At the end of the day, maybe we haven't had enough fruits or vegetables, or we haven't gotten enough fiber. And so how can we, put more focus on making sure that we're meeting our individualized needs? And then the last one, and I have mentioned this a little bit here earlier, is trying to limit foods and beverages that are higher in added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium. And so, making sure, again, that we're just being more mindful about consuming foods that we know that's in there. So one of my favorite ways to put these recommendations into practice is to discuss the My Plate eating method, because I really think that this is a dietary eating pattern that kind of meets you in the middle. It almost meets you where you are. And so what is the My Plate? It's actually an eating method that encourages the inclusion of the 5 food groups. And the 5 food groups are fruits, vegetables, grains, protein, and dairy products. And the recommendation is to first fill half of your plate with fruits and vegetables, fill a quarter of your plate with a grain source, and we oftentimes will say try to make at least half of your grains whole grain sources, and then the other quarter of your plate with some type of protein. It can be a plant-based protein, it can be a lean animal protein source. Again, customizing it to make it how you like it and how you like to enjoy that food. And then the last food group is the dairy products. So trying to include a dairy source with your meal. And there's so many reasons why I love the My Plate eating method. I feel like I implement this personally, but I also recommend this for people that I work with. But there's so many reasons to love it, but just a few that I can think of off the top of my head are, the ability to make it your own. As I mentioned previously, it's so important that we're enjoying the foods that we are eating, because there's so much more to eating and nutrition than just the food that we're consuming. And so, really making sure that the foods and beverages that you are including are things that you really do enjoy and bring you joy. And so that is an easy way to add the foods and beverages that you actually like. It also, helps to make sure that you're getting a nice variety of foods. As I mentioned, the recommendation is to try to include all of the food groups at each of these meals. And so that's also giving you those essential vitamins and minerals that we need. It's giving you the macronutrients and other dietary components that we require. And then the final thing that I like to mention about the My Plate is that it allows you to kind of keep your portion sizes in check without really even thinking about it. If you're following that recommendation, as I mentioned before, with how you lay your plate out, for the most part, you're going to also be staying in check with your portion sizes, and then also customizing them to make them your own, because we all have different nutrition needs. All right, so the last set of topics that I wanted to discuss with you, and just, there's kind of a few here that we wanted to highlight, are some of these obstacles that we have to overcome when we are thinking about making balanced choices. And we do want to make balanced choices, but how can we overcome these obstacles? And so one of them might be having access or easy access to fresh foods. And so I have a few tips for you with this. And one of them would be to check to see if you live near a local community garden, or even look into see if you can maybe start a little garden of your own if you have the resources to do so, because there's nothing more fulfilling than growing and eating your own produce. I think that there's something very special about that. Also, if that isn't an option, I know in my area at least, local farmers markets are starting to open back up again. And so I think that it would be beneficial for you to maybe check out your area and see if farmers markets are an option for you. And then if neither of those work out, I always say that frozen and or canned fruits, vegetables, and proteins are always another source, in order to be able to get some of these foods that maybe you aren't able to consume fresh. But again, with like the frozen and canned options, just making sure that you're watching like the added sugars and that sodium amount on those food products. Another topic that gets brought up is how to eat healthy on a budget. And some of my favorite tips to give when I'm talking about ways to eat healthy on a budget would be to try to buy things in bulk. And especially if this makes sense for your household. I know it maybe doesn't for everyone, but even if it doesn't make sense, there might be some things that you could buy in bulk just because we know that the shelf life is quite long and that it'll keep. So when I think about buying things in bulk, I oftentimes will think about some of those pantry staples like beans and pasta, rice, cereal, herbs and spices. You can get very large containers of those, and again, they keep for quite a while. And then another one that I like to think about when I'm buying in bulk is different protein sources. And so I'll oftentimes see in the meat department, there's larger packages of maybe different poultry sources or ground meats. And I think that those are some of the easiest ones to buy in bulk because you can come home, maybe put them in individualized containers or plastic bags and then freeze them, and you'll end up being able to use them as needed. But hopefully you will have gotten a better price on some of those proteins when you purchase a larger package. And then another tip I like to give when I'm trying to eat healthy on a budget is, and this might not be for everyone, but I love eggs. I could eat eggs probably at every meal, but I love adding eggs to a dish because it's an easy protein source. There's also other essential nutrients in there that are good for us, but it also goes with so many different types of foods. You can add it to a breakfast dish easily. You can add it to a lunch or dinner dish, and it can complete the meal. Sometimes I like to have an egg, as a snack, like over a piece of toast or a hard-boiled egg with some vegetables. There's so many different things that you can do with eggs, and so I always recommend that if you like eggs. Another topic that gets brought up is healthy options when you're pressed for time. And so I know that a lot of us are busy and that sometimes food gets put to the back burner. And so we really want to try to find ways that are going to work with our schedule where we can maybe try to do some meal prepping. And so I oftentimes will tell people to try to designate a day of the week that you might have a little extra time, and then try to maybe prepare a couple meals, or maybe even just start with one for that week. And then you can individualize those portions out and have them ready to go waiting for you versus the other way around. Another tip that I like to give when you are going to prepare a meal is maybe try to double or even triple the recipe, because again, you can do the same type of thing. You can individualize those portions out, throw them in the fridge or the freezer, and then in the following days they'll be ready for you to have for a quick lunch or dinner. And then my last tip that I like to give is, if you're pressed for time, maybe trying to have some readily available, like heavier snack, almost like small meal type foods ready to go. So it's easy for you to grab, and if you're on the run, it'll be something for you to have until your next meal. All right, so another topic that I oftentimes get asked about is dining out and making good food choices when you are going to be dining out. So there's a couple things that I like to tell people. If it's possible, plan ahead. I know sometimes when we go to eat out, we're not always aware that we're going to be eating out. Maybe it's a last minute decision. But if you are able to plan ahead, maybe start thinking, hours before you're gonna go, what sounds good, or what am I hungry for? Because that will maybe give you a little bit more focus when you actually do get there to make a choice. And then again, if it is available, try to view the menu online to see if you can pick out something that sounds good before you even get to the restaurant. And then another thing I like to bring up about dining out is trying to take some of the focus off of the food and maybe enjoying the social aspect of dining out. I know for me, I don't feel like I dine out very often, and so sometimes when I do get the option to do so, I like to maybe try foods that I wouldn't always eat, or maybe foods that I wouldn't always prepare for myself just because maybe someone else can prepare better. And so maybe trying to take some of the focus off of the food and just enjoying the social aspect and the social scene of the dining out experience. And then the last thing I wanted to mention to you today was simple substitutions, or ways that you can modify recipes or how you're eating. And so one of my favorite ways to do this is you really need to kind of be focused on what type of substitution you are going to be making. For instance, if you're making a big main dish, maybe you can find ways to add extra vegetables or switch out some of the animal-based protein for a plant-based protein option, if that's a substitution that you would like to make. Another example that I like to give with this is I love to bake, and I like to make all different types of baked goods. But a lot of the times with these baked goods, I'm always looking for ways that I can substitute or modify some of the fat source in there. Maybe it's butter or oil, and I might try to find ways to add a different type of fat source that's maybe a little bit of a better choice. And so sometimes I'll add things like non-fat yogurt, maybe some light sour cream. If it fits with the recipe, I might add like a mashed banana or some pureed pumpkin, something that will take away some of that fat source but still allow it to be moist. And so those are just some examples. I know there's so many ways that you can modify and make substitutions, but kind of start small, make one substitution at a time, and then maybe when you get more comfortable with it, you can make more modifications within the same recipe. All right, so that is what I have for you today. Thanks so much for joining me. Remember that your workout routine is an important part of a healthy lifestyle. Revisit the onbuildingbetterlives.com website for more information on nutrition. That can include recipes, a Q&A on nutritional supplements, and much more. So thank you so much for your time. Bye-bye.